couple of weeks ago, I asked you to email me questions that you had for me, and I would respond to them periodically in videos here on my second channel, MoreDougDeMuro. So today, the question I'm responding to is, what are all the cars me, Doug DeMuro, has owned in my lifetime? Now, before I get started, I want to mention you can send me questions at MoreDougDeMuro@gmail.com, the email address you see on the screen there. I asked people to send in questions a couple of weeks ago, and when I opened up the email account after a week, it had already 1,200 emails in it from people with questions to answer here. I'm totally blown away by the support for MoreDougDeMuro, my second channel. I can't believe how many views and subscribers it already has, and I guess now I actually have to make some good videos for it. But one of the things I realized with all the questions that I got was that some of them were along similar themes. And one of the questions I got very frequently was something like, tell me what cars you've owned before. Here's an example. What if you gave every single car you ever owned a Doug score? Here's another example. Hope you're doing well. Huge fan. Wonder what are all the cars you've owned since you first learned how to drive. Now, I first got my driver's license when I was 16 years old in 2004. That was 14 years ago. And since then, I have had 26 vehicles. Now, I have my computer out because when you have had 26 vehicles, it gets a little difficult to keep track of them. So I have a little spreadsheet with all of them, and I run the Carfax reports on all of them a couple times a year just to kind of keep tabs on what they're all up to. Now, I find it really, really, really important to answer this question, and I'm glad so many people asked it, because I feel that if you're providing car reviews and car commentary and car criticism, you should be upfront about your own biases, your own inclinations, the vehicles you've spent your own money on. You know, I wouldn't trust a car review of someone who's had 12 Volkswagens and they're obsessed with Volkswagen, and then they review the Jetta. It's like, well, you've got a bias going in. And so I think it's really important for car journalists, and frankly all journalists and critics, to kind of disclose what those biases are, which is why I'm happy to be really open about all of the cars that I've owned. So my first car, car number one, was a 1996 Volvo 850 Turbo. This is the car that I had in high school. It was a white 850 turbo sedan. In the US, these were all automatics. The thing that was really cool for me was this was the most powerful car in my high school. Even though it only had 222 horsepower, that was enough. This car was absolutely incredibly unreliable. I went to high school in Denver, and when I went off to college in Atlanta, my parents sold it to someone in Fort Collins, Colorado, north of Denver, and 12 years later, those people still have it. So somewhere driving around Fort Collins is my old white 1996 Volvo 850 Turbo. The next year, I got a 2001 Audi A4. It was about 2007 when I got this car. My parents bought it for me for $10,000, which seemed to me to be the most insane amount of money at the time for any car. I was so thrilled to have this Audi A4. It was an A4 2.8 liter sedan with a V6. It was quattro, like all A4s in Denver at the time were, and had an automatic, Tiptronic, which I actually used. Eventually, that car had transmission failure, not because I used the Tiptronic, but because all of the Tiptronic Audis of that era had transmission failure, some sooner than others. And I ended up selling that car to a Volkswagen dealer. Every other car on this list I bought myself. I sold that car to a Volkswagen dealer for 500 bucks with the transmission dead, and I bought a CPO certified pre-owned 2007 Volkswagen GTI, a Mark V. This was United Gray with a cloth interior, which at the time, and maybe still today, was plaid. Sort of like harkening back to the old GTIs and Golf from the 80s. It was super cool. It was like a return to form for the GTI. So I had that. It was a manual transmission. It was a two-door GTI, which was kind of a nightmare. Eventually, when I started working at Porsche, I had a company car with Porsche that was a company leased car, and I just sold the GTI to someone in North Carolina. My next car, my fourth car, I had a 1995 Toyota Landcruiser. This was the 80 series Landcruiser. I bought this car at a public auto auction. I just was driving along the highway, so I signed for a public auto auction. A couple weekends later, I went back, and they were selling a Landcruiser, and everybody there was looking for like fuel-efficient, dependable cars, and this thing crosses the block, and I'm like, this thing will run forever. So I bought it, but I didn't really have a need or a purpose for a 95 Toyota Landcruiser. But it was so cheap. I paid 1,500 bucks for this thing at this auto auction that I couldn't pass it up. And eventually I sold it to CarMax. They'll buy any car from me. I sold it to CarMax for like 1,800 bucks. And according to the Carfax on that car, it then was exported to Africa. like a lot of used cars, especially used Toyota SUVs and trucks from the United States. My next car was a 1998 BMW M3 Sedan. So this was an E66 M3 Sedan. It was white with a like light gray, whitish interior. This was a stick shift, so it was an M345, M3 4-door 5-speed. And I really liked this car. I had always wanted an E36 M3 my whole life growing up. And so I got the M3. I spent like $8,500 on it, which at the time to me was like, oh, should I really do this? I'm so scared. I was so nervous about spending that much. And it was great. I had that car, I think, 6 months. When it was time to move on, I sold it to a guy in Indiana who eventually himself sold it to someone who totaled it. And then it was rebuilt, and now it's in Ohio on a rebuilt title. So if you got a rebuilt title E36 M3 in Ohio and it's white, you might be driving my old car. Now, it's worth noting, at this point in my life, I then bought like 10 cars in the span of a year and a half. And that's because at the time, I was living in Georgia, and Georgia had an exemption on sales tax for private sales. So if you bought a car from some dude, you didn't have to pay any sales tax on it. So you could easily just buy a car, drive it for 3-4 months, sell it for the same price you paid, and not be out any money. And so I took advantage of this dramatically. The next car I got was a 2001 Mercedes E63 Amg, probably the car that I most regret selling. It was silver with a black interior. I absolutely loved this car. It was from the era before AMG cars were sort of so showy like they are now, and so angry and muscular, and this thing was just subtle, but it was fast, it was solid, well built. I sold that car to an attorney in the Atlanta area. He is still driving it, and at the time I had it, it had like no miles on it, but he's been dailying it now for like 6 years, and so it's been miled up. My next car was a 1993 Mercedes 500e. The 500e was a special car. It was an E-Class sedan, but at the time, Mercedes was like trying to get into this performance business with their normal cars, and they farmed out the production of this car to Porsche. So there was an E-Class that was actually built in Porsche's factory in Zuffenhausen in Stuttgart, in Germany. Porsche, basically what they had to do, they had to do some suspension work and widen the front fenders in order to fit the bigger engine from the Mercedes 500 SL and the S-Class. I bought my car, which had 80,000 miles on it, for like $7 grand, and I turned around and flipped it immediately. I had a ton of offers and interest once people saw me posting it on social media. I flipped it for like 12, but I actually think it'd be worth like 20 or 25 today. Next up, I had an 06 Lotus Elise. I've talked about this car a bunch. I wanted some cool sports car. I bought a chrome orange Elise. I bought it in San Jose, California. I drove it all the way back to Atlanta. I realized on day 2 that it didn't have operating air conditioning, which was a difficulty in the desert and especially in the southeast. Eventually I broke down and replaced the air conditioning. I sold that car locally to a guy in Atlanta who since sold it, and then it's got sold again, and now it's in Texas, and it's got like 75,000 miles. It's gotta be one of the highest mileage Elises out there. Next I had an 04 Cadillac Cts-V. This was the V1, the first generation V. It was a stick shift. I liked this car. I bought it because it was a great deal. The guy I bought it from was getting deported, and he had no choice but to sell it to me. So he did, and it was a great car. I had it for a little while, no complaints. I still highly recommend these to people who are sort of in this 10 to 15,000 budget and want something fast. It's also practical and reliable. I don't really miss it. It had an old interior. The transmission was really terrible, but it handled amazingly. It had a lot of power. I thought it was cool looking, and that car is now in South Carolina. The next car I had a 2002 Mercedes G500. I really wanted a G-Wagon. Anybody who off-roads even a little bit has always wanted a G-Wagon because they're so capable from the factory. I bought a 2002. It was one of the very first, it was the first year in the United States. Mine was a launch car, one of the very first 1,000 that came into the US. Unfortunately, this car had a bunch of rust, which I didn't discover until after I bought it, and I ended up selling it to CarMax with a pretty substantial loss. CarMax sold it to some other dealer who apparently fixed the rust. That car went down to Tampa, and it was involved in a fatal hit and run in Tampa like 5 years after I owned it, which is kind of eerie. There's actually security footage of it driving away. They eventually caught the guy. But that was sort of the most interesting thing that's happened to one of my vehicles after I had it. Next, I had a 2001 Porsche 911 Turbo. I'd always wanted a 911. I couldn't afford the newer ones or the older ones. The 996 was the Porsche I could afford, and the regular 996s all had this IMS problem, which at the time terrified me, and the turbo models did not have that problem, so I got a 996 Turbo, and I loved that car, but I really wanted an E63 AMG Wagon. So I sold that for a 2007 E63 AMG Wagon. I bought it from a guy in Indiana. Unfortunately, when I owned the E63, it was a really cool car. I loved it. It was a bizarre pewter color. Unfortunately, when I owned it, it was rear-ended by a drunk driver at a stoplight. So I sold that car to a guy in Dallas who I'm actually still in contact with. He eventually sold that car on Bring a Trailer to someone back in Atlanta. After that, I decided I really wanted a Range Rover Classic, so I got a 95 Range Rover Classic. That's the best year, the only year they had airbags. This is the coolest car in the world. I thought that then, I still think it. Unfortunately, it's also the worst car in the world. Horribly unreliable. Shouldn't have ever had it. It broke down 3 times in the 6 months that I had it. I eventually sold that to a guy in Dallas as well. He had a manual Land Rover Discovery, and I figured he knew what he was getting into. My next car is my 2006 Range Rover, which you already know about. I updated that last week. I bought that car December 2012. I've had it almost 6 years. Next after that, I had a 2001 Toyota Prius. A buddy of mine in Atlanta was moving to New York City and he couldn't take a car, and I capitalized on his desperation and I bought this thing from him for like $1,500, the first gen Prius. And I drove it around. It was a nice fuel efficient car to drive occasionally and leave places like at a friend's house or whatever. But eventually I sold that on Craigslist to a kid in Nashville, and I think he still has it. The next car after that, I had a 2009 Nissan Cube. I had a video or two about the Cube early on. I got this from my brother. He was moving across country. He didn't want to, he got a Cube. He needed something practical. Obviously, at some point quickly, he didn't want it anymore. So I inherited it when he moved across the country and got an Xterra, which he still owns. I sold the Cube to someone in 2014 in South Carolina, and last I checked, it is still on the road. Now, after the Cube, I get into cars that people who watch my channel, who followed along, kind of know. I had a 2011 Cts-V Wagon. I loved that car, drove it across the country and back. I sold that car to a guy in Houston who crashed it. He fell asleep at the wheel, went off the road, crashed into a tree, totaled it. Last I heard was like a year after he crashed it, I found the engine on eBay Italy, and that was that. After that, I had an 04 Ferrari 360. Obviously, I made a lot of videos on that for the channel when I started it. I sold it to a guy, I lived in Philadelphia when I had it, but I sold it to a guy in California, in the Sacramento area. After that, I had a 95 Hummer. I used that car to run over the PT Cruiser, famously. Worst car I ever owned by a wide margin. Terrible car. I had a gas engine, but that was only 1/58th of the problems with that car. It was reliable. It was just massive and awful and stupid, and I hated it. As anyone does, I think, who has one of those. But I had that, did some videos of the channel, sold that to a guy in New Hampshire who still has it. After that, I had a 1990 Nissan Skyline GTR, the right-hand drive Skyline that I had, made a ton of videos with that. That now lives in Kansas. Next up, I had an 07 Aston Martin V8 Vantage. That car was special to me. I didn't love the car, it was fine. But the special part was I drove it across the country. I drove it to 35 states, to Canada and DC. What can I say? I mean, I have a picture of that car next to a bison. How many Aston Martin owners have a picture of their Aston Martin next to a bison? That is about as special of a road trip as I think I will ever do in my entire life. That car I sold to Tavares, the YouTuber in Central Florida, but he sold it to someone in New Jersey, so that car is now back in the Northeast in New Jersey. After that, I had a 97 Dodge Viper GTS, blue with white stripes. Made a few videos in that car. I loved it, but I didn't drive it all that much. It wasn't good for Philadelphia. I had it during the winter. It just wasn't the best. Eventually, I sold that car to a guy in New Jersey, and he's still driving it. After that, I had a 1989 Nissan Escargot, which is one of my favorite cars I've ever had. I wish I hadn't sold it. It was like $9 grand. It didn't take up that much space. It was just cool. But I didn't need it. I wasn't using it. It was carbureted, and so I'd let it sit for a while, and I had trouble starting, and I was just like, forget it. So I sold that. I get a lot of people asking me, well, what happened to the Escargot? I sold that to a guy in Kansas who uses it as a pizza delivery vehicle for his pizza company. The company is called AJ's Pizzeria, and they have locations, I guess, in Manhattan, Kansas, and maybe somewhere else in Kansas. But one funny thing, occasionally someone will tweet me, someone in Manhattan, Kansas, will tweet me and say, oh, I just saw your old Escargot. And it's now covered in the AJ's Pizzeria livery, but it's out there delivering pizzas, which frankly is what that car was made to be for. That's what it's best at. After that, it's the ones you know well. 97 Land Rover Defender 90, which I still have, 2012 E63 AMG station wagon, which I still have, and my Ford GT, which of course I just got a couple of weeks ago. And those are my 26 cars. Now, in terms of automotive bias, I want to say I'm happy that I've never really ever had any allegations of bias. Nobody's ever come to me and said, oh, you're biased because you like this brand or that brand. And I think my car history shows that I just love cars. The country of origin of these cars, all right? 9 German cars, 5 American cars, 5 British cars, 5 Japanese cars, 1 Swedish car, and 1 Italian car. They're all over the map. I've never had a Korean car, but otherwise they are all over the map. There's no brand that I particularly like more than any other, but I don't have any specific affinity for them. I maybe like Mercedes a little more than other brands, but I'm very keen on their flaws as well. Land Rover, I just make fun of them, even though I had a bunch. But as you can tell, my car history is kind of all over the map. But I've bought what I liked, and I have no regrets about any of it. Feel free to send me more questions, MoreDougDeMuro@gmail.com, and I will reply to them, or maybe not.